Hello and welcome back to Art of Science. My name is Graham Ambrose, your host here on Art of Science, a quarterly interview podcast that coincides with each issue of Policy Studies Journal. Just a quick reminder up front to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. But today I'm excited to have three guests with us. We have Jack Mewhirter, Associate Professor of the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Cincinnati. We have Dr. Dani McLaughlin, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Kent State. And we have Dr. Brian Calfano, professor in the Department of Journalism in the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Cincinnati. So in the May issue of PSJ, our guests here today have a paper that is manifesting symbolic representation through collaborative policy making. And just at a high level, the authors argue that collaborative research has often focused on the effects of group composition and forum outputs, but not focusing on the composition impacts on perceptions of everyday citizens. The work tries to bridge collaborative governance and representative bureaucracy literatures. And our guests here today show that greater participation by civil society groups in collaboration result in positive spillovers for police departments organizing these forums. So with that, I would like to start off by just opening it up to our guests here and asking if they'll just dig in a little bit further to the paper.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Graham. This is an exciting opportunity. So this project is a really cool sort of combination of both theory building and really stakeholder-oriented research that resulted in some pretty sort of important and tangible findings that are salient for police-community relationships. So for this project, we were studying a specific mandated collaboration between Cincinnati police and a whole host of key civil society groups. Brian was really our sort of eyes on the ground for this work and can talk in a bit more detail about that mandate. But what we were really trying to do for this paper from a theoretical perspective is, like you said, bridge the collaborative governance and representative bureaucracy literatures, which both really share sort of core foundational tenets surrounding the importance of diversity and representation in policymaking processes, but which were sort of previously disconnected literatures that didn't really speak to one another. So there's really a lot of great work in the collaborative governance field that shows organizational diversity and representation within these collaborative venues are really instrumental in producing more effective and equitable policy solutions, right? But most of this work stems from the lens of like those policy actors that are involved in the process, right? So what we were really interested in, and again, like you said, do these positive outcomes spill over at all to the public? You know, the public are often direct consumers of these decisions that get made in the collaborative venues. They're often co-producers of these decisions. What do they think of these collaborative processes, the organizations involved, and do certain features of the collaborative venue, like in our case, representation and diversity, impact those viewpoints? And I think this is where we were really like, okay, we should sort of weave in these core theories of representation from the representative bureaucracy literature, which in and of itself is, super robust, has a really good handle on how demographic representation in, for example, a bureaucracy during policy implementation processes can really impact citizens' perceptions of the bureaucracy, right? This is what that literature would call symbolic representation, which says that, independent of any action taken by a bureaucrat or a policy actor, the public may perceive a demographically representative bureaucrat or bureaucracy as sort of sharing their norms, sharing their interests, sharing their policy incentives, and thus really perceive that organization a bit more positively. So we really borrowed this logic of symbolic representation, again, looking at demographic representation during implementation processes, to argue that this could translate to this idea of organizational representation during collaborative policymaking. And that if the public sees their community's interests are being faithfully represented by organizations like certain civil society groups, that they may perceive other participating organizations like police officers, like police administrators, in a more positive light. I know Jack can talk a little bit about sort of the empirics of testing this contention, but as a quick preview, we do find support for this manifestation of symbolic representation, and that citizens who are aware of this collaborative form and the representation within this form, they do hold more positive perceptions in terms of trust and legitimacy in the police. I don't know, Jack, do you want to talk a bit about what we think are sort of our core contributions?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of really like neat little pieces and lessons that sort of came out of this for a multitude of different sort of actors and interests, right? So in terms of like the collaborative governance or the polycentric governance literature, the complex governance literature even, right? It really does show that like, one of the main concerns that people have been raising lately is that, perhaps there's sort of these democratic deficits associated with collaborative processes. They sort of go under the radar. We can't hold these people accountable, right? There are power dynamics and asymmetries that we don't see that affect everyday citizens. And what we see is that, when everyday citizens do perceive collaborative processes, it really does have a big impact on the way that they feel represented, either for better or for worse, right? So this is something that we really need to start thinking about is how are citizens being represented, and can the observance of collaborative processes sort of reduce these democratic deficits that we've been sort of opining about, but not really studying very well, right? On top of that, what we sort of see, like Danny sort of alluded to, right, is we have this, fascination with organizational composition in collaborative venues, right? And we have such an output-oriented approach, right? Sort of really focusing on sort of the development of policy outputs and sort of like leaving it there, right? What we really see is that like this is just one side of the coin, right? Sure, representation and organizational diversity, mean a lot for shaping outputs, but really it might affect everyday citizens, and in turn, the way that co-production and in turn implementation processes work sort of at the ground level. So this is something that we've maybe been missing, right? Foreign composition matters because it helps, shape better outputs, but it also matters because it helps shape the way that citizens perceive organizations and interact with them, right? In terms of the representative bureaucracy literature, I mean, what we show is that like this isn't just during implementation, right? There are other parts of the policy process where representation also matters. So let's scale it back, or let's move back in the process a little bit and look at how collaborative, proceedings, sort of, or how representation in those proceedings might make sense or might not. More so, like Danny said too, like let's move out of just demographics, right? Representation can manifest in a multitude of different variables, not just what you look like or how you see yourself on the ground, but potentially all sorts of other things, including the types of organizations that are present, right? Which is really what we're showing. Finally, sort of like, I think that, it's really neat about this paper, and not to like toot our own horns too much, right? But like, I think it's sort of like rare that, at least in my work on complex governance and sort of collaborative governance, we sort of take this like big picture systems level approach often, right? And sort of just look at the numbers, crunch the data, right? But as Brian can sort of attest, probably a little bit later at some point, right? Like we're working with stakeholders on the ground, right? And this is where our data generating process is coming from. It's a real lived world example where we're listening to citizens and seeing how citizens feel and how they are being represented, and seeing how that observance of representation affects the way that they live their everyday lives and interact with one of the most contentious bureaucracies that exists in major metropolitan cities, which is the police, right? We're seeing that these people who perceive collaborative proceedings and feel that they're being represented are more likely to listen to police, right? To feel that even though they disagree with choices that police are making, that they should maybe act calmly and before, disobeying orders and things like this. Considering that, oftentimes, sort of the criminology literature shows that, how you think police are going to behave when you're stopped can sort of be a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Shaping those sort of a priori expectations about your interactions with police is really key to keeping people safe and keeping community safe, right? And police officers safe themselves, right? And if we can sort of like, as we're sort of showing in our results, actually like transform people's expectations about police interactions just by virtue of them being and acknowledging collaborative proceedings, like that's a really powerful take-home message, and one that I think police and other agencies can use to achieve better outcomes and to keep the people happier and to keep the people safe. So I think that's a really sort of important take-home.
Wonderful. I really appreciate it. And I just want to kind of interject and echo components that you have already mentioned. I think one thing that I personally really enjoyed about this paper is kind of bridging those literatures, right? So what does the collaborative governance literature do really well when we think about representation, and what is the representative bureaucracy literature doing really well as well? Thinking about those outputs, but also thinking about citizens and how they're perceiving those outputs as well. And like you've mentioned already, I think that is an important but really interesting part of this paper. And I wanted to ask, Dani, you alluded to it already. Just kind of breaking down. I think there was more effort than what I see elsewhere in this paper to say, okay, well, here's also like 7 other explanations for why we might be getting these results. And I'm just curious, kind of the thought process around like really systematically going through. And it was really nice, a really nice discussion, but it isn't something that we see a lot of. So I'm just curious, kind of the background behind that, and your thoughts.
Yeah,
I
Jeff.
feel like you're about to push that to me.
Absolutely.
I was like, I saw that one coming. Anywho, yeah, so Greg, that's a really interesting question, right? And I think that the answer is constant. I was about to say feedback, but maybe criticism is a better word, right? This paper has been a really long time coming. Like, I really don't want to tell the story too much because Brian has a great origin story of sort of how this all played out, right? But we have been working on this paper, I think, since like 2019, 2020, something like that. Yeah. And just, it's gone through so many iterations. And, the thing that we keep coming back to is that, like, citizen perceptions and knowledge, right, of institutions is just so serially correlated with, perceptions about the bureaucrats within those organizations, right, that are doing it, right? So we have all these sort of chicken and egg problems that have really sort of been pointed out by a multitude of different reviewers as we've gone through. And, we've shopped this paper around at conferences. So I think like for, probably 6-7 different conferences now. And to me, this is like, not to go off on too much of a tangent, like the beauty of conferences, right, is like, I think that there's a time to show off, like, your best project, right? And that's perfectly done. And especially if you're on the job market, right? Like, that's probably the way you should go about it. But, when you have tenure protections and stuff like that, you can sort of afford to present things that you don't have sorted yet, right? And being able to sort of have that ability to shop this paper around and get like invaluable feedback, right? At Copper, at Midwest, at ABSA, I think we presented it to. I think we even did this at APAM. We've done this at like 4 or 5 different places and gotten this just like multitude of criticisms. And every single time we got that sort of negative feedback, like maybe there's another causal pathway, maybe there's something else, right? Then really, like we tried to deal with it, right, in a really calm and holistic sort of way as best as we could. So for instance, 2 of the ones that we came up with was, despite doing this, in my mind, like in mainly led by Brian, right, like Herculean data collection effort, right, where we use this venue sampling method of going to these apolitical events to sort of sample Cincinnati's urban core, right, to tap into the beliefs of citizens who are walking around and being policed, right, and who are most likely to interact with the police, mainly the poor Black community within Cincinnati's urban core, right? This incredible thing, we went to really try to capture on the ground who these people were, a very hard to reach population. And we thought we did a great job. And then on top of that, like, well, yes, we captured many of the demographics that we hoped. There were still problems. The people who were willing to take the survey were more educated. They actually tended to be predominantly women who were interested in taking our survey, right? They had a bit higher of an income than we were hoping for, right? So one of the criticisms was, our entire method, our entire data generating process was designed to capture the urban core, but maybe we did a little bit better of capturing the high educated population within that urban core a little bit more, which was a bit problematic. So how can we say that these results really are extending to the population that we care most about, right? So in order to do that, like, I had no idea, right? So then we had to learn, a brand new method that essentially attaches, which is inserting an algorithm that assigns weights to individuals within that population to sort of make an underlying population represent different populations of interest, right? Which is common in some sort of causal, public health studies, but isn't super popular within political science and public policy and public admin. So we learned this, it's called, oh God, what is it called?
Raking.
Raking. Not scraping, data raking, right? Which is super helpful and a super powerful tool, and sort of, looked at made the data look like two diverse populations to see how far we can bend this population sample to make sure it's not sample specific, right? So we made it look like the everyday Cincinnati people, like just this, city of Cincinnati. And then we made it look like Cincinnati's urban core in 1990 when riots were taking place, right? And see whether our sample looked like that urban core then, would the sample or would the results have held? And in fact, they were, interestingly enough, stronger under that raked sample. Another one that we kept going to was like, maybe you're just capturing some general phenomenon of like trust in institutions, right? And trust in knowledge in institutions. And so, that was one that came out of more of the sort of econometric, sort of like very stern, public policy evaluation mindset, right? And due to that, we were forced to sort of go back to the table and sort of look at potential placebo outcome tests, right? So we looked at whether knowledge of the collaborative agreement predicted trust in other institutions, right? That were unrelated to policing. And if that was the case, then maybe that's really what we're showing. But in fact, that we showed that knowledge of collaborative agreements and collaborative processes has no impact on trust in other institutions in Cincinnati, giving a lot more validity to our claim that there's a direct link between knowledge of collaborative agreements and trust in police, and it's not capturing a broader phenomenon more generally. I think there's a couple more robustness checks in there, but those are the ones I'm like most proud of. But yeah, I think that to me, like, we really cared about this paper. We really took our time, and we only submitted it once, right? And it was to PSJ. And the reason why I think it was so, we were able to get it in, and why I think this paper is going to hopefully have a really good impact and has a high degree of validity to the claims that we're making is really due to the constant feedback that we got at like 4 or 5 different conferences. Like, I got comments like, "Are you going to stop like submitting this to conferences?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not." But yeah, that's sort of the origin of all of that, and sort of how we went about it. But it's sort of a luxury, given sort of the time and publications, the publisher pairs sort of things that are associated with the tenure track process. And me and Brian had protections from that, so we dragged our feet. Sorry, Dani. But I think that our ability to sort of drag our feet and shop this around and make sure we did it right, really gave rise to how solid I think this paper ended up being in the long run.
That's great. And you alluded to it earlier, Jack, and Brian, I will get to the origin story of the project, but I think it's a really interesting concept. I think I would love to hear from all three of you on this, kind of the feast or famine, or the publish or perish kind of idea, that the real benefit that I'm hearing is that you had time to really solidify a good argument in the paper, but potentially that's not afforded to everybody in where they are in the PhD tenure process and post the tenure process. I guess I'm just curious, kind of like, what your thoughts, if you can all each kind of dig into that a little bit and talk about, what is the value of balancing, like getting stuff out quickly, getting a lot out quickly, compared to like just having like really clean, really nice, really well argued papers. Just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Dani, you want to go first? I feel like we'll go in like order of tenure, so not recent, long term.
Yeah. So I just wrapped up my second year, and I'm in my second year as an assistant professor, and I'm in that stage of like feeling like, okay, like it's time. I got to make sure I have enough pubs out to reach tenure. But I would say, like, reflecting back on, the little bit of experience I have, and the few publications I have, I think the ones I I cared about most, the ones that I think I was most passionate about, are the ones that I definitely took my time on, but they're also the ones that like hit highest, right? They're also the ones that I feel like the field is most valuable to the field, right? Like, so I don't know, there is obviously that balance between, you do got to get some things out and you don't have that luxury of shopping it to 5 conferences. You know, you got one conference, you get an R&R, you take that feedback and you try to make it better. But I think if you can balance that with the projects that you have the most passion about, and maybe take your time on a few, right? The few that you care about, the few that you think might hit highest, might matter most for practitioners, might matter most for people, for people on the ground, that it's worth it, right? There is a balance between also, like, hitting everything in a high journal, and having some papers in medium, second tier, third tier journals, right? Like, a balance in your work, I think, is it's nice to have that balance. So I don't know, as a second year, that's my
Yeah, it's really tough, right? So like looking back to what 3-4 years ago, like when I was in Dani's position, right? Like I was so paranoid. Like anytime I sent a paper out, I'm like, this has to hit or else I'm just going to die, right? Like I'm not going to get tenure. I'm going to have to like move back in with my parents. Like this is all going to be what happens in life, right? But now having the luxury of tenure, like, yeah, it is freedom, right? And freedom of sort of escaping that publisher parish, at least, on a temporary basis. But, that time component of publishing and marching up to getting jobs and to getting the tenure record, it really is a walk full of perverse incentives that can be sort of landmines in your own process, right? And it is an incredibly difficult balancing act to sort of figure out. And with a paper like this, I mean, in a sense, like, I felt as though, given that we're talking about ways to potentially improve policing practices on the ground, and we're talking to actual stakeholders who are looking for this feedback, and we're sharing the results, we're hopefully going to present this at public forums, like to citizens and to the police, right? Like, I sort of viewed myself as having a sort of moral responsibility of doing this right, and making sure that I was making claims that I could back up. And as I sort of grow a bit older in the field, like Dani was sort of saying, right? Like I just keep finding myself as the more that I'm intellectually honest in my work, and the more I'm like, in some papers, I'm like, this is a cool association. I could be wrong, right? Here are some alternative explanations. Some I can deal with, some I can't, right? I found that those papers just read more honest, right? They feel more honest, and those papers tend to land higher. I feel like when I was sort of, a bit younger, in the discipline, and was trying to publish as fast as I possibly could, my failure to sort of see those alternative arguments and counter them before reviewers saw them led to like a lot of daggers to the heart from reviewers, right? So it is a difficult balancing act, right? But I feel like if you take the allotted time that you can, make sure that you're intellectually honest in your processes, I think that more times than not, those sort of papers that you do spend the appropriate amount of time on and you are intellectually honest about tend to be much better received. But I mean, it is such, the publisher parish and the incentives of getting a job and getting tenure are just so incredibly difficult, especially, and it's only getting worse. So I feel for junior scholars who are really facing these problems more, and I have the luxury of largely being shielded from it right now, but they still exist, even at these stages. But yeah, I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, like, it's hard, and I'm sorry, like for the younger generation of scholars coming through, and how to navigate this in such an intense and competitive marketplace of sort of ideas. It's really difficult. What do you think, Brian?
You guys just said it all. No, I think what I would say is, too, don't forget, a lot of this has to do with the people you're working with. And you can have a great experience going to conferences, but I don't know about you or anybody who's watching this. I've been to enough conferences to know as well, you can get all kinds of wonderful feedback, and it doesn't quite reflect what you're getting when you send the paper out for review. All of a sudden, this amazing paper has been dinged by 3 reviewers, and it's pretty demoralizing. But there's something to be said, I think, for the people you work with and you co-author with. I mean, I know for a fact that I am Dani and Jack's favorite co-author to begin with. So it's just a wonderful thing to be able to have conversations, to work through problems or work through these sort of ways of presenting questions and alternatives, or even just new concepts, and to do so while you're hashing it out among each other, and then come up with what you think is going to be putting your best foot forward, proverbially, in the paper. So I think there's really good things to say about co-authorship. I know going up for tenure, that depending on the department that you're in, that may or may not be a good thing. It may be looked upon as slightly diminutive, depending on the department and the standards for tenure. But once you get past that, if you've got a good research network and a good co-author group, I think that can be invaluable. I don't know that people reflect on that as much as they ought to.
Wonderful. That's great. And the spread of kind of tenure, I think, is also a wonderful kind of just thinking through that process at different points is a really nice spectrum. But Brian, so we have this origin story that's been alluded to. So if you'd be willing to kind of talk about the origin story of this project, and then opening it up to kind of say, well, what was the origin, and how has it kind of changed and solidified into this project that we have here?
Sure. Well, technically the origin goes back to the founding of Cincinnati. It's not really even this paper, but it is the centuries of social, political, economic interactions between persons of color and white dominant economic, political, and social groups that have effectively run most of America historically. And when you put those ingredients together over a period of decades, you begin to see that persons of color have had a far different experience in terms of their ability to affect political change or to even have the franchise. And the point with this paper is not so much that type of story, but the general background in terms of how we came to the data collection and what data collection was about, fundamentally focused on that collaborative agreement that Jack and Dani had mentioned earlier. And it's apropos to be talking about that because we're coming up on an anniversary of the agreement itself. The collaborative is something that is unique. It is not, to the best of my knowledge, replicated in any other city or any other municipality in the United States. It's a federal district court order established in 2002 that made the ACLU, the Cincinnati Black United Front, which is a community activist group, the City of Cincinnati Police Department, and the City of Cincinnati government effectively mutually accountable for coming up with a series of reforms and actually working to ensure that those reforms were implemented. And part of the reform process was the focus on soliciting feedback and incorporating that feedback from the community. So the community itself is part of this process by court order. And this is far different from what people tend to confuse the collaborative agreement with, which is a consent decree, which comes down from the Department of Justice. There's some kind of malfeasance that the department detects in police activity in a locality, and the Department of Justice comes in and effectively says, here's what you're not doing right. You have to do these things better. We're going to monitor you to make sure that that happens. This had nothing to do with the Department of Justice. It was organic in the sense that you had these groups come together to become mutually accountable. And yes, the federal district judge had to kind of get the police to play along more nicely than they were willing to do at the time. But the set of circumstances that led to this situation for the data collection and for the perspectives that our respondents had really doesn't exist anywhere else. I don't think you would have been able to pull off the project the way that we did if it had been in any other place. And I know therefore, oh, well, is it generalizable and that sort of thing? I think yes, still, because you're still talking about municipalities trying to get this combination right, trying to figure out, okay, what is it about this participatory governance and these different models that Dani and Jack spoke of that incorporates public and makes sure that their voices are effectively heard in the governance process, no matter what their current setup is. But I just think it's cool to think about where Cincinnati plays a role in all of this. And this origin story, for modern purposes, goes back to 2001. And there was an uprising in the city over what was then, I believe, the 12th murder of an unarmed Black man in a matter of 4 or 5 years. And this set off a series of uprisings throughout the city, and it led to eventually this collaborative agreement. And the collaborative has been a work in process and in progress. It's not the sort of thing that you just sort of put into motion and everything ends up being fine and there's never any downside or there's never any unmet expectations. In fact, depending on who you might talk to in the community, there have been many unmet expectations, even though the collaborative is a unique instrument. And so what's interesting about these situations our respondents find themselves in is that they're in the middle of a process of being able to work proactively and collaboratively with these city entities, but to do so at a time when they're also able to call out the entities, to say, you're not doing what the collaborative actually calls for in terms of data on policing, in terms of problem-solving orientations toward policing, and in terms of effectively showing respect to all persons. Because obviously this is the point of social and city services to begin with, is that you're showing respect to the people who are paying for those services in the first place. So Cincinnati has been at the forefront of this kind of reform movement because it is, like too many cities recently in the last several years, seen the devastation of what happens when you don't have a responsive governance structure. You don't have people who are willing to say, what is it that we're missing? What is going on with this particular group feeling disenfranchised or being disenfranchised on a regular basis? And so the data come from a series of, as Jack, I believe, said, non-political gatherings, social gatherings across the city where people were approached to complete this survey instrument. And, that's a decent amount of work. It's one thing to have a probability sample and you're able to do some kind of hybrid survey where you've got the email and telephone and maybe I guess snail mail platforms that you're able to use, but you're not necessarily going to get the kind of natural oversample that we did. You're not going to come up with those kinds of, because Rand has done this. Rand has done a series of studies of the city, and the number of, let's say, African Americans that they end up with is what you'd expect out of really the national U.S. Census percentage. That's not something I think that there's anything to write home about. It's not something that ends up being really that useful. I think when you look at our sample and you look at the work that went into it, even though it's not probability based, you're still talking about relatively equal number of African Americans and Caucasians, which reflect the demographic split within Cincinnati itself. So you're talking about actual people who are dealing with these situations on a regular basis, and you've got two groups of roughly equal size in the sample that you're able to use for comparative purposes. And, nothing's perfect from a research standpoint, obviously, but I think I would take our sampling approach over a probability sample like the ones that have been used. If we had $1 million, we could do something else as well and probably have the best of both worlds. But hopefully that's an interesting enough origin story for you. It has been and continues to be a challenging environment to have people complete surveys. One of them, as a community activist that I work with, she's always saying people are tired of filling these things out. They're tired of talking about this. They need to see some action and that sort of thing. And so I think, too, it was good that we were able to get the kind of response that we did because it's true. People have been over-surveyed on a lot of these questions. But be that as it may, we were able to be successful, and I think the paper is all the better for it.
Yeah, Brian, I appreciate this, and it's a wonderful origin story. I just have two kind of follow-up interconnected questions, right? So I feel like a theme on the podcast that comes up kind of over and over again, especially when it's like a sampled study, is like, how do you make these relationships with communities, right? Because we're often trying to reach out to communities that maybe are underserved or are more vulnerable. And coming from institutions as big as our universities often are, that also have historical contexts, I'm just curious if you can kind of speak to navigating those relationships, and what that actually meant for kind of the extra work, the second part. You talked about it being more work. That work is, in your mind, important, as you've already stated, but what does it mean to navigate that, and what does that mean for like practical work to like really expend resources to get at this important sample?
Sure. Yeah, I'll give you the best shot I can in answering that. And if I miss something, just feel free to ask for more. But from my perspective, at least, what establishing those relationships mean is, you're going to have to be willing to work with these groups and individuals, not from the standpoint of, oh, I'm the researcher, but, going almost, I guess, as sociologists would say, into the field. Because you're thinking now more in terms of, I want to demonstrate to folks that I'm someone who's trustworthy, and I'm someone who is just not here to study like I'm on Mount Olympus and, try to make some kind of evaluation of what's happening, but then I'm someone who's concerned about the same issues that these folks are. And that, my form of activism might look a lot different from theirs, but in a way, working through the publication process on the academic side of things is still bringing attention to important issues, just like many of the folks who are neighborhood or community activists would want to do. But you have to be willing to show up at those meetings, and you have to be willing to invest in the relationships. And I know that sort of sounds, well, of course, duh. Yeah, but that also means that there's lots of times when you don't really notice any progress. In other words, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, I want to go make this connection because it means I'm going to end up having an opportunity maybe to do some research with this group. And you keep showing up and you keep going to dinners and you keep going to meetings and you have events, and nobody's talking about what you want to talk about. Nobody's talking about, hey, what about that survey? Or, hey, what about these focus groups? They're not doing that because they have other things, like real things to worry about, important things to worry about. And what you're doing is building a degree of capital with the group and with the people. But that's going to take a lot of investment. It's going to take time on your part to do. And you have to be prepared to do that. And if you're looking at this as a finite period of time and say, okay, I got to have this done in 3 months or 6 months, I think you're setting yourself up for failure unless you get lucky, unless there's some need on the part of the group that says, hey, we actually were looking for somebody to come in and do this survey. That's initially what happened with me. I was around, and one of my administrators at the university knew there was a need, and that was the initial conversation. But beyond that, this continuing relationship that I have has been something that is an up and a down, not in the sense of, not liking people, loving them at certain times, hating them at others, but more you're just aware of the rhythm of their lives and of what their work is. And none of this is linear. I mean, we may talk about that from a modeling standpoint and say, well, we have more participatory governance and people are more interested in that sort of thing. Well, yes. But in terms of how it looks to individuals on the ground, they may be seeing things slip away. They may think that they had progress prior to this, and now they're seeing things regress. And that's important to be invested in, and to appreciate that kind of perspective, because you'll find that there's the one step forward and 2 step back kind of cliche. It's cliche, it is, but it's also true in a lot of respects. So as the researcher, you got to be prepared to not even navigate that, but embrace it and be aware of it and realize that at some point maybe they'll get back to your agenda, but that may be a while. And you have to prove your trustworthiness. You have to prove that you're there for more than just writing the paper, because that's exactly what a lot of people become skeptical about. Oh, you're the academic, so you're here to study us. That is really the worst thing that can happen to you if you're trying to do this kind of work, because it creates this barrier beyond what already exists, potentially. Other things that seem maybe trite, but I think are really practical. I moved to the downtown for a variety of reasons. One, I'm paying taxes in the city, whether I want to or not, because of where I work. So I figure, well, if I'm paying taxes, I might as well live in the city. The other thing is, if I'm downtown, I'm actually right by City Hall. There's a steady stream of folks walking into City Hall for city council meetings or for whatever else they're doing on a regular basis. And so I'm out and about. I see people. I recognize them now. They see me. They say hello. We talk about what's going on. Being physically accessible on a regular basis. Like, I'm not driving in for a meeting. I'm here. Kind of planting yourself, I think, is really important. And, not to step on anybody's toes, but I don't know that a lot of academics really understand that. I think, they think they can do this from afar, potentially, and, they get their data set and they're able to do their work from a distance. That's just not going to happen in a lot of cases, and it's not going to really bode well for a long-term kind of relationship. So you have to be prepared to not maybe live in an area where you thought, oh, I'm going to be in this beautiful suburb in a gated community and all that kind of thing. You may be living downtown. You may have to get used to the notion that, if you really want to understand something and see something and experience it, you've got to do it more than just every once in a while. And so that would be big as a point. And then the last thing I would say is be prepared to spend your own resources. You're going to be prepared to actually have to do work without money, without pay. You're not going to get necessarily a fee for your consulting or anything else that you're doing. Even if you create a report, I can't tell you, and I'm sure it's the same thing with Jack and Dani, how many freebies we've created. And it's not in any sense I say that as a pejorative, like, I'm going to do this for people. I don't have any problem doing it, because it's about building trust and building relationships. And it's to the point where you have to look at what's the greater good. If it's something that you're able to say, okay, look, I participated in this research not only because I was observing and I was helping design the survey, but I put sweat equity into it, or I spent some of my own capital on it. That gives you a moral sense of ownership in the work, more than you would have had before if you were sort of just the paid person to come in and look at the data set and that sort of thing. So I don't know if those are satisfying answers to you, but those are the things that pop off the top of my head as experiences that I've had that I think are important for people to consider.
Well, just to add a little bit in to sort of synopsize, right, for some people, I think that, like, getting into these sort of networks just in general, especially as a new professor moving to a new town, right? Or a grad student who might not be inundated or integrated into these networks yet, right? Getting in is tough, right? It is. And I think that, being able to leverage your own networks to find these opportunities and these ends is probably the most valuable sort of aspect, right? Like, walk in the path that, others at your institution have already sort of cleared the ground for, right? And then extend it a little bit more. It's always easier to sort of extend the path than build a new one sometimes, right? And so I think finding where, there is some institutional legacy and trust with, right, and going to those networks is great. If you're, really interested in studying a bureaucracy or a subset of organizations or governance system where there is no foundational work, like, then you have to be prepared to show up at those meetings, right? You have to be able to prepared to, write emails and not hear back, or to make calls, right? As much as you can. And that can be really difficult. But I think that key to all of this, right, is really being able to, as maybe this is just me being a collaborative governance person, right? But finding mutually beneficial agreements that others might not see, right? So why are we doing work with, the city of Cincinnati, right? And helping them run, so for instance, like Dani and I, to some extent, we're helping run city audits, right? For basically free, right? Like Brian has been working with the Black United Front of Cincinnati, basically for free. Like we do it because we do feel, we have the skill set to help contribute to society in a way, right? But we also do it because there is a benefit. This does aid our research, right? Sure, we will put in 50, 60, 70 hours of work for you, but that is also generating data sets and things that we can also use, right? This is a mutually beneficial solution to, solving two problems at once. Like we're helping audit the city, we're helping generate results for the Black United Front and the city of Cincinnati more generally, but we're also building data sets that we can learn from and use for our own purposes as well. So the ability to sort of identify these mutually beneficial, arrangements that can be made, and having sort of the energy and the confidence to go out and put yourself out there and to propose them, is really good, right? And I think that's like a necessary condition for moving forward. And it's not something like going up and meeting, people and proposing, agreements with them and stakeholder groups and city workers and government agencies and stuff like that. It's not something that like I took a class on, right? This is something that I think that once you get socialized into the discipline a little bit more, you can sort of, reach out to your mentors, reach out to your network and see how others have done it before and sort of take that advice in stride, I think.
The only other thing I would add just really briefly is this importance of co-production too, right? Like you are co-producing your research with these groups. Like I'm on two different projects right now where we got on one initial pushback for groups completing a survey because we did not initially sort of co-produce our research questions, co-produce the survey questions with those groups. And now we're working with that group and gonna distribute a different type of survey. The second, like one of the main sort of funding points from the funder was, we want you co-producing this research, working intimately with these groups to co-produce research questions. What do they see as sort of opportunities and barriers to the types of things you're interested in? So, just to add to sort of what Brian and Jack said, these are these people's lives, right? So if they can be involved in as much of the sort of research process, what we're studying, how we're studying it, that's super important too. And it really helps with buy-in and sort of, building and cultivating those relationships for the long run.
Wonderful. I appreciate all of these comments and kind of all the advice that's been riddled through this whole conversation so far. So I guess I just have a more reflective question, and that being, if you could give yourself advice when you were an earlier scholar, is there stuff that feels really apparent now that you wish you would have known 5, 10, 15 years ago?
I'll start since I am an early scholar, and this sort of something Brian said about your co-authors and your importance of your network sort of sparked this for me. So obviously I don't have the 5 to 10 years of experience, but I think one of the more important decisions I made over the past few years, and obviously experiences and opportunities vary for everyone, but for me, it was completing a postdoc. Now, I'm not saying like turn down a tenure track, right? But the postdoc was really important for me. It provided, a whole different sort of network of scholars that I'm continuing to work with. I hopefully see as sort of lifelong collaborators and mentors. I was really fortunate enough to land on a really diverse and interdisciplinary project that's a bit different from the work I had been doing on my dissertation or the network of collaborators I had previously built. I'm continuing to work with these folks today. These PIs continue to be important mentors in my life. So I think the sort of network of collaborators, networks of scholars you rely on as co-writers, you rely on as reviewers, it can really be the sort of impetus for a successful career. And if you have the luxury or the opportunity to build that group out in a way that is a bit more formal, right? Taking a postdoc if you can, that it was really important for me. So for other young scholars, it might be a nugget of wisdom there.
That's great. Jack or Brian?
I guess I know. I don't know. Like, what is the best advice I'd give myself? Honestly, like, don't force it sometimes. You know what I mean? I think that sometimes it's, you know, and it's okay to be wrong, right? That's like, you know, maybe like, don't force a project. It's okay to be wrong, right? We're gonna put in, you know, I was convinced that when I was younger, every single one of my paper ideas was doable, and I was right, and I just needed to find the right data, you know, and if I could just get it done, you know, it would all be good. But, you know, what I've sort of found now is that, like, you know, if you have some humility in the way that you approach your design, right, you can listen to others, you can learn, you know, from reviewers saying that, you know, your theory is just complete garbage, it's hackneyed, it's horrible, right? And you can actually adapt and learn, and with that humility sort of grow, instead of always be sort of combative about forcing your ideas and making that paper that you originally wrote work, right? I think that would have been better for me in the long run, right? And I also think that, you know, at times, and this is so difficult, right? We were talking about this, you know, time constraint and publisher perish idea earlier, right? But taking the time to listen, taking the time to read, you know, taking the time to really, you know, take a break from producing and to actually be able to be a consumer again, right, of knowledge, right, was something that I just didn't feel like I had the time for in my first few years on the tenure track, right? It was just produce. I think if I would have spent a little bit more time consuming, listening, getting feedback, I think that would have helped sort of alleviate some of the challenges that I faced on my tenure track run, and would have put me on a little bit better of a foot forward. But everything turned out all right, so we're always learning, right? What about you, Brian?
Yeah, I would say you need to be prepared to better translate your work for the public, because particularly with this sort of research, you know, you get like one chance for people to try to get their head around what it is you're talking about. And if they're going, well, I don't know what all of those big terms mean, and, you know, you're talking above my head, and, you know, a bunch of eggheads and all this other sort of stuff, then you lose the opportunity. And, you know, you might not get that again. And so there's the internal impressing that we do with each other, I think. You know, look, this great model, and this is the area of the literature I'm speaking to, and all the rest of it. But at some point, you have to be able to turn that around and make it somehow relatable to the person on the street. Because especially with this type of research, that's what we're talking about at the end of the day. And we're talking about their incorporation in the governance process. And that's critical. So you don't really have the luxury of pleasing the three people who are going to review the paper, or the people at the conference, or whatever. There's a much larger constituency out there that you have to find a way to relate to. And that's an ongoing process. It's not a destination. It's really that kind of journey. There's always ways to improve with that.
Wonderful. I really appreciate it. We're just rounding up on the hour here. So I just want to give space first, if there's any kind of concluding thoughts about kind of advice or reflections on the paper, or whatever it might end up being. Want to certainly give you guys the space to have those concluding thoughts. If not,
Jack, don't you have anything else to say, Jack?
I mean, the truth behind, I think, this paper, right, is I'm super glad that we got it out, right? But this one has been sort of a journey, right? Nothing like I guess my final word of advice is, like, don't fear the uncertainty, right? And be prepared to sort of adapt and grow where sort of papers and projects take you, right? This project, you know, originally, you know, start off as just sort of an atheoretical evaluation into sort of like collaborative governance and how it affects citizens, who knows about it, you know, how do they feel about it, and these things. And then, we sort of developed an expectation that it would affect the way they interact with police, but we sort of, had a theoretical sort of like, gap in why do we all suspect that knowing about collaboration would lead to better perceptions about police? Why do we think that it would affect the way they interact with police, right? So what started off as a very easy sort of econometric evaluation study turned into a, search for an answer, right? And the search for an answer took us down two different rabbit holes, right? Representative bureaucracy and collaborative governance. And we had to find a bridge to connect those two holes, right? And it took us 4 years to do it. More headaches than I can count, more times that I want to throw this paper away than I can count, and to start something new. And then finally, when we were able to sort of realize, how to connect the dots, how to build that bridge, and did we only really understand sort of like why we thought it was so important, right? It's a very holistic process. And if we didn't have sort of the fortitude and we didn't have the intellectual curiosity and we just wanted to sort of pigeonhole ourselves into our original idea, this paper would have never got off the ground, right? And so, in my way, like, connecting back to my other sort of advice, like, the path that you think you're going to take on projects and papers isn't usually the one that it's going to end up being. Like, be adaptive. Don't be disheartened when, you encounter barriers. And, in this case, every barrier we came into, turned out to be an opportunity in disguise. And I think we learned a lot about it. And we produced something that, I don't know, that I think we're all really proud of. And so it's been awesome to get to share it with you. So.
Great. I just want to say thank you to each, Dani, Jack, and Brian, for spending the last hour chatting with me. It's been a privilege and interesting to hear kind of your thoughts about the process, but also your thoughts about what it means to be an academic on this tenure track. So I'm thankful for that. Thank you for spending the time with me. And to round out the podcast, I just want to remind people to rate, review, and subscribe as they're listening to it. And additionally, to follow the Art of Science pod on Twitter. Thank you to both Policy Studies Journal, but also the Center for Policy Design and Governance at Syracuse University. Both are supporting this joint initiative. And with that, again, thank you to our three guests today, and I'll see the rest of you next quarter.
Thank you.
Thanks, Graham.